Speaking about the past and present, that's of course is an art. And it's an art where the history of the past and the chronicle of the present that has to converge very subtly. And when we talk about that, what are the challenges to capture that political economy or the contemporary economic history? The significance why I'm saying this is an art is, things are happening around us. It's an art to capture that daily events that could be of value and prove that it is of historic interest in future. So that is critically important, that sense of heterogeneous time to capture the important events. I think this is very important exercise for the students. When you articulate, the content may vary. It can be an analytical work or it can be a content you create for a wider audience. But how you pick up, those contemporary events which may be of value and how you interpret it as a historical importance, that is very crucial, because otherwise we will not be aware of the political economy narratives and we will just get translated into technocrats. And technocrats without the understanding of the political economy narratives, that analysis can be quite skewed. So whether we are talking about the public debt or whether we are talking about the North Bengal, we have to place or stand firm in that political economy narrative. Otherwise, a strict technical exercise, that can lead to, a kind of a lack of hysteresis that can lead to a kind of partial results. So that's the first thing I would love to, tell to the students. Of course, I enjoyed all the presentations, but that hysteresis, the dependence of an economy on history, that is very crucial to analyze, to understand that sense of heterogeneity of time and how to capture that. And we have certain examples how, political scientists and social scientists capture the time, the economic history, that analytical framework. For instance, Karl Marx used the class struggles in the history as an analytical framework for his writing, especially when he wrote about the contemporary history of France. And of course, the political spirituality was that analytical framework used by Fouquet in translating the revolutionary events in Iran. So what could be that analytical framework to understand the history, the past and present of West Bengal? Could it be social and economic justice in a federal setup? Is it justice? From even the fiscal perspective, is it a fiscal justice what we are talking about? Or are we talking about a kind of convergence which we want, an economic convergence, which I mentioned to the last presentation, to the authors of that paper? Is that economic convergence we are looking into when we formulate the policy and when we incorporate the hysteresis? Is that the case? Then equality in the processes, whether it is political or whether it is a policy, that equality in the processes, why? That's not leading to equality in outcomes. Because you can say that we are not biased as politicians or policymakers. We are performing based on equal opportunity paradigm. Like the way, for instance, we have generated, schools or infrastructure or hospitals based on the belief that equal opportunity that will work. But that belief behind the public policies, that equal opportunity will work, that doesn't, right? Because, when you can't remove the unfreedoms of the vulnerable population, when you can't get all people on board, when you do a policy in which you don't leave anybody behind, that leave nobody behind paradigm, then equality in the processes or that belief in equality in opportunities will not translate into equality in outcome. So for me, as a public policy maker, this is what exactly is public policy. You have to remove the unfreedoms of people to get them to access the market or to participate in the economy. And this exactly is the reason what Professor Mukherjee pointed out, that we had a wonderful policy that is employer of last resort. Government guaranteeing jobs to the people. Government acting as an employer of last resort. But in his statistics, in his empirical evidence, we have seen that why a certain segment of population is not coming and accessing it. Dave, your friend, I forgot her name. She also, brilliantly analyzed her experience in the field, and she mentioned that where it works and where it doesn't work. Then she brilliantly applied a gender lens also to that. And she mentioned that it is demand driven. But if it is demand driven, why, when government comes out with a policy on employer of last resort, why there is uneven access? So we need to tackle many complementary fiscal policies based on the belief that equality in processes will not lead to equality in outcomes. We need to emphasize certain other elements in the public policy which can remove the logical entry barriers of the vulnerable people, and they can come and access what government provides. And that exactly is the role of public policy, and that exactly is the role of a government. So we need to look into the histories, we need to look into the contemporary history, and of course the past of West Bengal, what exactly has happened from this perspective. What exactly was that analytical framework? And of course, if you get into the federal institutions, fiscal consolidation and fiscal policy, Bengal can learn from Greece. In the sense, fiscal austerity, that was a non-political agenda, but it was an economic agenda in which the mavericks, the professors, the journalists, many people in that realm of society came together and formed a party in Greece. Because the political or the financial oligarchy, when that started dictating a state's finances and state's policy, that was the response of Greece to the fiscal austerity measures. And fiscal austerity became the political agenda. And from there, that Syriza party came up. And my, peers, my colleagues in Levy Economic Institute of Bard College, New York, Rania Antonopoulos and Dimitri, who was the executive president there, they were the part of that movement, and they became, Dimitri became the the Minister of Economy, and Rania became the Minister of Labor. So their policy perspective was like, if the financial oligarchy dictates about your state, dictates about your country, what is the degrees of freedom in which you can operate? Here, why I said that West Bengal can learn from Greece, because in the European Union context, what holds a country together when we think about that? Of course, as Professor Mukherjee pointed out, it is the political institutions. It is institutions. That's why, a nation fails when institutions fail. And that itself is very important, that institutions. And in the context of European Union, the countries came together based on the economic integration. And now you can see that there are many cultural fissures, and there are many things that is disintegrating that country. And from the public policy perspective, the tool that was available for Greece or any member nations for that matter was the fiscal policy. Because monetary policy was exogenous, exchange rate, that policy was exogenous. And on the top of that, when you have only the fiscal policy, the Maastricht Treaty came to being. What exactly was the Maastricht Treaty? It was based on the belief that not more than 3% you can have of the GDP, you can have your deficit. So when you have only fiscal policy, which you can maneuver for the economic growth and development of a country, then the fiscal austerity or this fiscal rules, the beginning of fiscal rules, how it affected the degrees of freedom of the government, that exactly is a lesson we can learn from Greece or from any member nations for that matter, which lost the game in European Union. And now, in Brookings' papers, you can read that work by Alessina Alberto. He was a Harvard economist. And there, it was that project of European Union a feasible project? You can read that paper of whether there were fissures, identity, culture. So there were many non-economic factors which came into being, which started articulating about that economic integration. That's why when we talk about the history, past and present, we need to interpret both economic factors and non-economic factors which are behind this. And economic convergence is, of course, to me, one of the prime policy goals. So what is that goal for West Bengal in future? I have seen your brochure. In that brochure, one of the questions you have asked that in future, what is that economic goal? So one thing is, of course, we need to have a policy which leaves nobody behind. LNOB, that is prior policy objective. And second is economic convergence. In the last presentation, it came out very clear that if you don't have the economic convergence, the poor regions, if it doesn't catch up with the rich regions, then what development, what focused development, what we are talking about state. So these are the two important, economic goals or the policy goals for me when we think about the future of economic development or future of socio-economic development in the context of, West Bengal. Otherwise, the fiscal consolidation or the fiscal austerity and too much, focus on the fiscal discipline, all these things can be detrimental if you cannot interpret it properly. And, if you talk about the overlapping generations model and the public debt, you need to be very cautious, and we should not err on the side of caution by being just fiscally disciplined by showing the numbers that I have 3% of GDP, my fiscal deficit. I don't have any revenue deficit. I phased it out. But what was the cost? Over the years, we have seen it in numbers that the fiscal discipline happened at the cost of capital formation in the economy. The gross capital formation was suffering. So that kind of fiscal austerity or that kind of fiscal discipline, that's not, the kind of methodology which we need to follow to tackle, economic growth recovery process. And these are extraordinary times, and we need to have extraordinary policy responses. And in that, accommodative fiscal policy stance, that's very crucial for the economic growth recovery. But of course, I am not talking about the fiscal profligacy or freebies, but using your fiscal response, the fiscal space, getting it right. You need to get that fiscal space right. But otherwise, expenditure compression other than tax buoyancy, if that is a path towards fiscal consolidation, then we cannot dream about, a growth outcome or a growth recovery. And I particularly enjoyed the points mentioned by Professor Mukherjee on the career theories. And he was talking about the experiences he had when he worked with the bureaucrats. That, of course, lead to a question that what leads to the economic growth? Whether it is economic and social factors or whether it is related to the personal characteristics of the bureaucrats or the political leaders. So this is a kind of, upcoming literature in the public policy or the public choice literature where you look into the personal characteristics of a bureaucrat or the personal characteristics of a political leader. So it looked like this. You ask a question whether the personal characteristics of a particular chief minister affects the kind of economic growth recovery you have in a state. Or you ask a question, the personal characteristics of a finance minister, that has got its own influence in, framing the path to fiscal consolidation. Of course, if the goal is fiscal consolidation, different finance ministers reach that fiscal consolidation goal through different paths. An economist, from a heterodox background who believes in the employer of last resort policy, who believes in the size of government, they may not do an expenditure compression to reach towards the economic or the fiscal consolidation. So that was particularly interesting when he talked about the career theories, or when he talks about the personal characteristics of the bureaucrats and the political leaders. And of course, as he rightly pointed out, we also need to look into the chronic capitalism. We need to ask the question why we have not grown. Is it because of the income inequalities which we have created as a part of growing a process? Or is it because of certain deals, certain kind of the state business relations that has happened in the state which led to inequalities, because the deals creates inequities in the system. So it is not just explaining that there were income inequalities, there were uneven recovery, but it also gets, strengthened by the deals that happens in the economy in terms of the state business relations, whether it's in the mining sector, whether it's an industrial sector. You need to tackle about the deals and how you interpret the capital. That is very important. Now, my final point is about the contradictory transformation that has happened. Of course, the analytical of political economy we can do during the emergency period. Then from 1977 onwards, there was, left front ruling the state. Then we had Parivartan in 2006. So we need to look into these broad political regime changes, or the broad, what you call the structural breaks, to understand the contemporary history and the past. Unless we do that or incorporate that in the models, then, we will be getting into just technocratic exercises. So we need to get that political economy variables into the model building to understand the economic growth process. Otherwise, economic growth is a function of many macroeconomic variables which we put, then that growth models may be partial if we don't incorporate these political economy variables and the elements of hysteresis. Because we have seen the reappearance of history recently in that unfamiliar electoral results, that Parivartan, that surge in new thinking and the protest against the land acquisitions. So all these things, the minorities and students' activism, youth activism. So that kind of vibrant, that civic vibrancy that is there in the state of West Bengal. Of course, a part is there in Kerala as well. So those things, these are the non-economic factors which contributes to the intellectual development process of the state, and we need to capture that. And that process needs to be, from the Bengal Development Collective perspective, I think you are looking towards these kind of methodologies, what you can capture and what you can, protect and analyze when you talk about the economic growth in future. There, when you look into the fiscal policy output gap sectorally, you need to incorporate that elements of the political economy variables. And here, in one way, what you can do is electoral regimes can be a wonderful variable. That's a way, we economists do the political economy variable. Otherwise, a broader structural breaks like emergency period, left front, Parivartan. So these phases you need to bring into as a structural breaks into the model, because I have seen the war model for the public debt, but those were strict models in terms of economic models, but the political economy variables needs to be captured to understand, the process of even the debt burden. Because I remember that in one of the slides, Aditya and his co-authors has rightly pointed out about that regimes, the Naxalist movement, everything, but you need to give, strengthen that framework in your analysis. And of course, if I look into the role of state, in 1977, of course, that Herculean task of normalizing society from a revolutionary phase of 1967 to 77, that happened. And, of course, if I think about it, the way the students, the revolutionists, the peasants and the workers, they contributed in that 10 years, that revolutionary period, whether that could be the analytical framework, whether that rebelliousness of our state, that kind of, that rebelliousness was never for an utopia, if that we have to understand. It was for the change, for better, better growth in all terms. It's a statement. It's not only for economic growth, but what is that contributed to the, growth and development for the state. We need to capture that, and we need to look into the phases of, those kind of movements, and of course, a part of state repression. And, these kind of analysis we need to look into along with a big government. The emphasis of 1977 was about a big government. Big, decisions, fiscal decisions they have taken in 1977, which contributed to growth in terms of poverty eradication, in terms of expansion of primary education, employment schemes, land reforms, and along with the implementation of the Panchayati Raj, that fiscal decentralization, that movement was very crucial. And when we compare to the other states, those kind of, institutional and democratic process of development has happened only in West Bengal. To a certain did that happened in Kerala. Other than that, these kind of institutions and that public action leading to the public policy, I think these examples are very rare when we compare to the other states. So we need to protect these histories when we look into what's ahead of us, and when we analyze the policy perspectives. Otherwise, if you don't capture that principle of subsidiarity, in the European context, also in the against the backdrop of COVID pandemic, this principle of subsidiarity is becoming a crucial policy strategy, in the sense we need to take decisions closer to the people. That is principle of subsidiarity. We need to give more importance to the decentralized democratic governance, and it is otherwise things will just dwindle down to one size fits all. And in that way, that governmentality operated in the state of West Bengal, that we need to analyze. And that governmentality, how it has affected the democracy process and how it has, contributed to the economic growth and development process of the state, that, we need to look into, because that has not created an anarchy, it has created a stability. But what were the political cost for creating that stability? That also needs to be looked into from a paradigm of beyond economic growth, because you need to look into the human development aspects. If you just confine that my future goal is just the economic growth, then we will not get perspectives correct, because democracy that naturally signified the choice of stability over anarchy, that is welcome, but many old injustices that were left unaddressed. So those inclusiveness in the policy perspectives, whether that is happening, or are we giving, more importance to the stability over inclusiveness? This political economy narrative needs to be looked into, and who is excluded, and our state is growing for whom? So these questions need to be looked into as a prerequisite. Otherwise, if growth, then stability. Growth and stability cannot be the paradigm, or cannot be the political goal or economic goal when we talk about the future of West Bengal. It has to be based on, inclusiveness as well. That's why, that aspect of governmentality, based on that strategy to control that excessive democratic vitality or the civic vibrancy which we have, especially in West Bengal and Kerala, there could be many trade-offs over there. And whether it is judiciously done, whom we are incentivizing, all these aspects of the governmentality tactics we need to look into, and we need to understand what went wrong. Whether party has substituted the society, or whether party committee substituted for government intelligence wing, whether, the kind of crony capitalism that has happened, what were that elements that led to, a lack of importance to a kind of promising a political strategy in the context of West Bengal, and what led to Parivartan. So we need to take a very honest assessment of these political strategies, whether we were, the victims of our own success, what exactly led to, the kind of entry of a third political party into West Bengal, and whether they are doing well. If they are doing well, in what aspects they have done well. We need to look into all these perspectives the moment we look into the economic history, because history repeats itself, and we need to analyze each of this political regime change, its success and its failures. And of course, a quick example that's coming to my mind is Singur, Nandigram. They were necessarily about the capitalism, the chronic not exactly that, but it is against that concept of capital. So those kind of deals, how they created inequality, we need to take a look into that. Otherwise, one size fits all policies, that kind of a symmetry in the development process can be detrimental. And we need to give space to the decentralized fiscal structure and the public debt burden. I would love to emphasize it again, that will not lead to a deep crisis if we use it correctly. And the fundamental fiscal issues in the changing cooperative federalism, that is also very crucial, as pointed out by the presenters, the students, that your fiscal space is not your own tax and non-taxes. It is also based on the intergovernmental fiscal relations. So what is that bargaining which the state required to get a fiscal space in the intergovernmental fiscal mechanism? Professor Mukherjee pointed out that we depended on many conditional grants, but now that is corrected, that from the conditionality we move to more or less towards the conditionality in the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. But we need to keep up the pressure in the bargaining tactics of the center and the state, especially when the political parties in power are different. And these are the crucial questions we need to look into, not only from within state perspectives, not only from between states perspective, but within the analytical framework of intergovernmental fiscal relations and the center state financial relations. And I stop here. Thank you so much.